The rain fell in a steady drizzle as Marcus Johnson tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his sleek sedan gliding smoothly down the quiet, tree-lined street. He was running late, a fact that irked him more than it should have. As a federal prosecutor, punctuality was a point of pride, but today, the universe seemed determined to test him. The GPS on his dashboard blinked, rerouting him through the small town of Willow Creek, a place he'd never heard of, let alone visited. Up ahead, flashing blue lights pierced the gray haze. Marcus frowned, glancing at his speedometer. He was driving 5 miles under the limit, cautious on the unfamiliar, slick roads. Still, the patrol car pulled him over. He rolled down his window. As the officer approached, his uniform damp from the rain. The man's face was stern, his eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus's appearance, his dark skin, his casual but expensive jacket, the faint scar above his eyebrow. License and registration, the officer said, his tone clipped. Marcus handed over the documents, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer didn't answer, immediately shining his flashlight into the car's interior, lingering on the briefcase in the passenger seat. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. He knew the drill. He'd seen it too many times. Black men pulled over for no reason, treated like suspects before they were even questioned. But he complied, stepping into the rain, his hands visible at his sides. The officer patted him down, his movements brisk and impersonal. "You mind telling me where you're headed?" "Work," Marcus replied, his tone even. "I'm a federal prosecutor. I have a case to prepare." The officer smirked, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Sure you are. Let's see what we've got here." Marcus watched as the officer rifled through his glove compartment, his trunk, even his briefcase, scattering papers and files across the wet pavement. The rain soaked through Marcus's clothes, but he stood tall, his expression unreadable. Finally, the officer handed him a ticket, speeding in failure to signal. "Court date's on the back. Don't miss it." Marcus took the ticket, his fingers brushing against the officer's gloved hand. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. As he drove away, his mind was already racing, not about the ticket, but about the system that allowed such blatant bias to thrive. And he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a modest brick building, its facade weathered by time and neglect. Marcus stepped inside, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years navigating courtrooms. But today, he was just another defendant in the eyes of the system. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of the few spectators. Marcus took a seat near the front, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came from a place where power was wielded carelessly. Judge Harold Grayson entered with a flourish, his black robe sweeping behind him. He was a man in his late 50s with a stern face and a reputation for being unyielding, especially toward defendants who didn't fit his idea of respectability. His gaze swept the room, lingering on Marcus for a moment before moving on. When Marcus's name was called, he approached the bench, his posture straight, his expression calm. The judge glanced at the file in front of him, then at Marcus, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Grayson began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're charged with speeding in failure to signal. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his tone steady. The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Not guilty? Officer Daniels seems to think otherwise, and I don't appreciate people wasting this court's time." Marcus took a deep breath, his hands clasped in front of him. "Your Honor, I was driving under the speed limit, and I signaled properly. I believe the officer's judgment was influenced by bias." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed, his face flushing with anger. "Are you accusing an officer of the law of misconduct?" "I'm stating a fact," Marcus said, his voice firm but respectful. "I have the right to defend myself." The judge leaned forward, his voice rising. "You're in my courtroom, Mr. Johnson. You'll show respect, or you'll be held in contempt. Now, I'm imposing a fine of $500, and I suggest you think twice before making baseless accusations." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," the judge snapped, slamming his gavel. "Next case." As Marcus turned to leave, he felt the weight of the judge's glare on his back. But beneath his calm exterior, a fire burned. He had seen enough injustice in his career to recognize it when it stared him in the face. And he wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of murmured conversations as Marcus turned back toward the bench. His calm demeanor cracked just enough to reveal the steel beneath. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small badge, its gold emblem catching the light. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "before you dismiss me, there's something you should know." Judge Grayson paused, his gavel hovering midair. His eyes flicked to the badge in Marcus's hand, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "I am Marcus Johnson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District," Marcus continued, his tone measured but firm. "I specialize in civil rights cases, particularly those involving judicial misconduct and systemic bias." The room fell deathly silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Judge Grayson's face drained of color, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's words. Marcus stepped closer to the bench, his eyes locked on the judge. "Your Honor, the way you've conducted this hearing, the dismissive tone, the excessive fine, the refusal to hear my defense, is not just unprofessional. It's a clear example of the kind of bias that undermines the integrity of our justice system." The judge opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus didn't wait for a response. "I've spent my career fighting for people who've been treated unfairly by those in power," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. "And today I've seen firsthand how easily that power can be abused. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's walked into this courtroom and left feeling like they didn't matter." The spectators in the room shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances, others staring at Marcus in awe. Judge Grayson finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier authority. "Mr. Johnson, Assistant U.S. Attorney Johnson," Marcus corrected, his tone sharp. "And I suggest you take a long, hard look at how you're running this court. Because if this is how you treat defendants, I can assure you this won't be the last time we meet." With that, Marcus turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom, the echo of his footsteps reverberating in the stunned silence. The judge sat frozen, his gavel still in hand, as the weight of Marcus's words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Outside, Marcus took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. He knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning. And he was ready. By the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. A video of Marcus's courtroom confrontation, recorded by a spectator on their phone, had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #JudicialReformNow. The small town of Willow Creek, once a quiet blip on the map, was now at the center of a national conversation about race, power, and accountability. Judge Harold Grayson's past rulings came under immediate scrutiny. Reporters dug into his record, uncovering a pattern of harsh sentences and dismissive behavior, particularly toward defendants of color. Local advocacy groups held press conferences demanding his resignation. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs bearing slogans like "No Justice, No Peace" and "Fire Judge Grayson." Inside his chambers, Grayson sat at his desk, his face pale and drawn. The phone on his desk rang incessantly, but he ignored it, staring at the stack of files in front of him. Each one represented a case he'd presided over, a decision he'd made. For the first time in his career, doubt crept in. Had he been fair? Or had he let his biases cloud his judgment? Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his office in the city, where he was greeted with a mix of admiration and concern. His colleagues praised his courage, but his supervisor pulled him aside. "Marcus, what you did was brave," she said, her tone cautious. "But You know this is going to get messy. Grayson's not going down without a fight, and neither will the system that protects him. Marcus nodded. I know, but someone had to call it out. If not me, then who? Back in Willow Creek, the pressure mounted. The state Judicial Review Board announced an investigation into Grayson's conduct, and a federal inquiry was rumored to be underway. Grayson's allies, few though they were, tried to defend him, but their voices were drowned out by the growing chorus of outrage. Marcus, for his part, stayed focused. He knew this was bigger than one judge or one courtroom. It was about the systemic issues that allowed bias to flourish unchecked. He began drafting a proposal for a task force to investigate judicial misconduct, determined to turn this moment into lasting change. As the sun set over Willow Creek, the courthouse stood silent, its doors closed for the day. But the storm brewing around it was far from over, and Marcus Johnson was just getting started. The investigation into Judge Harold Grayson's conduct concluded swiftly, its findings as damning as they were undeniable. The Judicial Review Board uncovered a decades-long pattern of biased rulings, discriminatory remarks, and a blatant disregard for due process. Grayson's career, once defined by his iron-fisted authority, ended with a single unceremonious announcement. He was removed from the bench, stripped of his title, and barred from ever serving as a judge again. The news was met with cheers from the protesters outside the courthouse, their chants of justice served, echoing through the streets of Willow Creek. For many, it was a rare victory, a moment when the system had actually held one of its own accountable. Marcus Johnson watched the announcement from his office, his expression thoughtful. He felt no satisfaction in Grayson's downfall, only a quiet determination to ensure this wasn't just a fleeting win. The task force he had proposed was approved, its mandate clear, to root out bias and misconduct in the judicial system. Marcus was named its chair, a role he accepted with a sense of solemn responsibility. In the months that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly, traveling across the state to hold hearings, review cases, and advocate for reforms. His story, the traffic stop, the courtroom confrontation, the investigation, became a rallying cry for those who had long felt voiceless. He was invited to speak at conferences, interviewed on national news programs, and even approached about running for public office. But Marcus declined. His place, he believed, was in the courtroom, fighting for justice from the inside. Back in Willow Creek, the town began to change. A new judge was appointed, one with a reputation for fairness and integrity. Community leaders organized workshops on racial bias and legal rights, and the local police department implemented mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation. One evening, as Marcus stood outside the courthouse, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The rain had returned, falling softly against the pavement, but this time it felt different. It felt like renewal. A young black man approached him, his eyes wide with admiration. Mr. Johnson, he said, I just want to say thank you. What you did, it gave me hope. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. Hope is important, he said, but action is what changes things. Keep fighting. As he walked away, Marcus knew the work was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that was enough.